how to untie the 6 knots. Thus, Ananda and the assembly listened to the compassionate Buddha's unsurpassed sermon and gatha, whose profound meanings were so enlightening and penetrating that their mental eyes were opened. They praised what they had never seen before. Ananda then brought his palms together, prostrated, and said, I have today listened to the Buddha's compassionate teaching, which revealed the pure, subtle, and permanent reality of the self-nature. But I am still not clear about how to untie the 6 knots, one after the other, and what you meant by, when the 6 knots are undone, the one also vanishes. Will you again take pity on this assembly and future generations and teach us in order to wash our defilements away? The Buddha, who was on his lion seat, adjusted his inner garments and outer robe, and took from the teepot a piece of beautiful cloth, which the Yamadeva had given him. Then, in the presence of the assembly, he tied a knot and showed it to Ananda, asking, What is this? Ananda and the others replied, It is a knot. The Buddha then tied another knot and asked, What is this? They all replied, This also is a knot. The Buddha tied 4 more knots, showing each to Ananda and asking, What is this? They all replied that each was a knot. The Buddha said to Ananda, When I first tied this cloth, you called it a knot. There is only one piece of cloth, but why did you call the 2nd and 3rd ties also knots? Ananda replied, World-honored one, although there is only one piece of cloth, if you tie it once, there will be a knot, and if you tie it 100 times, there will be 100 knots. But this cloth has only 6 knots, because you only tied it 6 times. Why do you agree to my calling the first tie a knot, and disagree to the 2nd and 3rd ones also being called knots? The Buddha said, Ananda, originally there was only one piece of cloth, but when I tied it 6 times, there were 6 knots. As you see it, the length of cloth was the same before, but is now different with its 6 knots. The first knot I tied was called the first one, and altogether I tied 6 of them. Do you think that the 6th one can be called the first knot? Ananda replied, No, world-honored one. So long as there are 6 knots, the last one is the 6th, and cannot be called the first. Even if I discuss this for the rest of my life, how can I number these 6 knots in the wrong order? The Buddha said, It is so. These 6 knots are different, but come from one length of cloth, and you cannot reverse their order. It is the same with your 6 sense organs, which, though coming from the same source, are manifestly different. Ananda, clearly you object to the 6 knots and prefer one piece of cloth, but how can you obtain it? Ananda replied, If these 6 knots remain, concepts of right and wrong will arise in great confusion. With such things as this knot is not that one, and that knot is not this one. World-honored one, if all the knots were untied, there would remain nothing, with complete elimination of thisness and thatness. Then, in the absence of even one, how can there be 6? The Buddha said, Likewise, when the 6 knots are untied, the one also vanishes. It is because of confusion in your mad mind, since the time without beginning, that your intellect gives rise to illusions, the unceasing creation of which disturbs your seeing and causes it to perceive objects in the same way that troubled eyes see dancing flowers. Hence, in the clear and bright reality arise without any cause all worldly phenomena, such as mountains, rivers, the great earth, samsara and nirvana, which are but dancing flowers created by confusion, trouble or passions, and inversion. Ananda asked, How can one untie these knots created by trouble and confusion? Then the Buddha held up the piece of cloth, pulled its left end, and asked, Can it be untied in this way? Ananda replied, No, world-honored one. The Buddha then pulled the right end and asked, "Can it be untied in this way?" Ananda replied, "No, world-honored one." The Buddha said, "I have pulled both ends of the cloth, but have been unable to untie the knots. What will you do now?" Ananda replied, "World-honored one, each knot should be untied in its center or heart." The Buddha said, "Correct, Ananda, correct. A knot should be untied from its heart. Ananda, the Buddha Dharma, which I expound, manifests due to causes and is beyond those coarse forms that come from worldly concepts of mixtures and unions. When the Buddha reveals the mundane and supramundane, he knows their chief causes and concurrent conditions. He is even clear about the number of drops of rain in a place as many miles away from here as there are sand grains in the Ganges, as well as why pine trees are straight and brambles crooked, geese white and crows black. Therefore, Ananda, choose one organ from the 6, and if its knot is untied, all objects of sense will vanish of themselves. When all illusions disappear, if this is not reality, what more do you expect? Ananda, tell me now if the 6 knots of this cloth can be untied simultaneously." Ananda replied, "No, world-honored one, because they were originally tied one after the other, and should be untied in the same order. Although they are in the same piece of cloth, they were not tied simultaneously. How can they now be untied all at once?" The Buddha said, "Your 6 organs should be disengaged in the same way. When you begin to disentangle them, you will realize that the ego is void. When this voidness is perfectly clear, you will realize that all dharma or phenomena are void. When you are disengaged from dharma, the voidness of ego and dharma will vanish. This is called the patient endurance of the uncreate, achieved by means of samadhi in the bodhisattva stage." After Ananda and the assembly had heard the Buddha's teaching, their understanding was clear and free from doubt and suspicion. Ananda brought his palms together, prostrated himself, and said, "Today our bodies and minds are clear, at ease, and unhindered. Though I have understood what you mean by the disappearance of both 1 and 6, I am still unable to perfect my sense organs. World-honored one, I am like a lonely wanderer and a hapless orphan. How fortunate have I been to meet the Buddha and to be his relative, like a hungry baby who suddenly meets its suckling mother. This gives me a chance to attain the holy goal. But although I have listened to his profound words, I am still unawakened, as if I had not heard them. Will you please reveal to me the ultimate approach by means of the appropriate organ?" After saying this, he prostrated himself and concentrated on his inner potentiality to receive the profound instruction. Thereat, the world-honored one said to the great bodhisattvas and the chief arhats in the assembly, "I want to ask you, bodhisattvas and arhats who have practiced my dharma and have reached the state beyond study, this question. When you developed your minds to awaken to the 18 fields of sense, which one did you regard as the best means of perfection, and by which methods did you enter the state of samadhi?"